Hello, and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by vampbug. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about democracy problems. Vampbug says, let's talk about democracy, I guess. I stumbled upon this podcast via a YouTuber I like, being on it, and I'd like more food for thought on these things they said that I'm going to list off and timestamp. You just seem like a good person to ask this. Here's a link to the video timestamped at the start of the conversation, and then I listened to some of it. I'll leave that in the description if you would like. But there's some quotes from it that you've written in the parlay. The first one is, I don't know if I intrinsically value hearing people out on the other side. The nature of democracy has been emotionally called into question because of social media. There's another quote that goes, you can democratically be horrible. You don't want mob justice. And then there's another point about this kind of conflict between different aspects of democracy. One, you have to respect the voice of your fellow person and everyone gets a say, but two, you have to use your voice to make justice happen, which those are in conflict to some extent. And the idea that democracy is like a skill. Vampbug says the conversation concludes for quite a while, obviously, but these talking points are what I'd like to zero in on. Thank you in advance. Have fun. I will. It sounds fun to me. So there are, I think, there are like two major points that I think are related by a single through line. And I think that through line and the theme for this parlay is going to be basically the idea that if you ask people to form an opinion about something that affects other people on the spot, there are various problems with that, to the point that it might have been better for everyone if they were not put on the spot in such a way. I personally think that having everyone's take when we all come together and create a human society is good, but you don't actually get everyone's take by literally asking every single person. That is not a good way to figure out every perspective, basically. So personally, my stake in this discussion is democracy, democracy, democracy. However, yeah, I mean, it's possible that we can come up with some better and not immediately dystopian way that's robbing people of their voices to hear people's voices better. I doubt I will come up with that during this discussion. Yeah? No. But that's what we're going to talk about. The idea that while it might be good to include things that everybody in a society values, you can't include those things by simply asking every single person what they are. It might seem like you can, but you can't, and I'm going to explain why I think that. Okay, so point number one. This was going back to these first quotes you mentioned. They said, quote, I don't know if I intrinsically value like hearing people out on the other side. The nature of democracy has been emotionally called into question because of social media. You can democratically be horrible. You don't want mob justice, end quote. So I took this slightly differently having watched it, but I would word it as like social media extremizing the negative aspects of democracy. I think it's easy to imagine that if you have a whole group of people that are all going to live together and their living decisions are going to affect each other, it sounds like if you're going to make a place where they can say, this is how I want things to work in this place we all live, it sounds like it would be good if everybody got to go there and say their piece, right? It affects everybody. If we have a town poll for where we're going to dig a new well, asking everybody for their input seems sensible. Like that seems to make sense. But when you scale it up a lot, the exact position of things matters less as all these factors increase. And you also see a lot less who voted for what. You know, it's not like digging a well in the center of town. Klim, who lives on the hill, clearly wants it nearer to the hill. And a lot of people in town will know that and agree that he has the most to lose if we put it in the center of town. Even though that would be really convenient for all of us, it really wouldn't be that much less convenient for all of us if we just put it on the edge of town near Klim's house. And Klim, our farmer, I mean, he's the one feeding us. He needs the water kind of relatively more for us. Like, it benefits us. It's not just us being selfless. And also, his relative gain and how far he has to go is a lot higher. Whereas we need to walk twice as far, but it's like 30 seconds compared to a minute. It just isn't a huge deal. And so we can see that. It's a small environment, and we know that is how that will affect this person. And so Mariette, who was going to say, oh, I want it near my house to grow the flowers, we all discuss, and she is able to agree that just isn't the greater good here. Like, we need to agree to have it be worse for this person, because when you can see the other benefits available in this situation, it's bluntly ridiculous to prioritize Mariette being able to go on a water run like 30 seconds faster rather than our farmer, needing to walk 1 or 2 minutes less for way more trips. And that's easy to understand with a small group of people. But I was saying, you scale things up, and it becomes much harder to see not just where the benefits are. Obviously, it's become more difficult to see exactly how the choices we're all making affect other people, our incredibly involved, entangled, complicated society, but also just the way that distance works in the modern world. There's a lot of factors, probably mostly obvious ones, that make it hard to see how, when we vote for something, that affects other people. If we vote for school to end at a certain time rather than another time, that is a surprisingly complicated issue, potentially, involving child safety with when they're walking to and from school, and when parents get off of work, or like babysitters getting paid at a certain time, and exactly how it keeps them in school, if that's going to have socioeconomic implications because of the climate of the area. How safe is it to be out at that time of the day? That's just not... Normal people just don't have an opinion about that subject that is helpful. You see what I'm trying to say? If you put it a different way, if I asked you, hey, do you want to be in charge of this topic? Or do you want someone who has the time to think about it to be in charge of this topic? I would be upset if any of you would say, I want to be in charge, instead of the person who has time to think about it, right? You'd expect most people would say, no, I don't want the responsibility. Yet, when we ask people to vote on these things, that pretty much is what we're doing. We're saying, you have no possible way to have a useful opinion about this, but we have decided that you must pass an opinion about this subject. And it's like, no, it doesn't seem good for you to need to do that. Why? To some extent, this is mitigated by the way that motions pass. You don't vote for every single little detail, of course. You can see why, when we go to vote, there's limited selections that have been curated by people who get to spend more time thinking about, like, what should be on the ballots, of course. But I think we all know just how problematic that gets. Because it's abstracted that way, you can create a kind of false positive or dichotomy. Things can seem like, well, of course I want more money for the citizens. Of course I'm not going to say no to me getting more money, when in fact sometimes that can backwardly be less advantageous for you individually. Maybe it'll take money away from public works. It may actually be a lot less of a humane option to seemingly give the taxpayer more of their money back. It depends. That's obviously very complex. Please don't, if you are having any thoughts about my political leaning right now, I don't have one. I think it is literally unhealthy to engage with modern politics the way that most people do. You're not going to find one. This is not me like subtly trying to induct people into communism or something. If you're thinking about that, it's not that I disagree with the view you think I have. It's that I just hold no specific view like that. I'm always going to say, well, it depends. If you say, do you think it's good for, tax law to go like X, Y, or Z? I'm immediately going to say, it depends. Are you ready to have a fully involved conversation about it? And if you say no, I'm going to say, I will not answer you then, And I personally think that that's how voting ought to work. If you go up to the ballot, the ideal situation for me would be everybody still votes, but when most people go to vote, they don't actually vote on any of the options because they realize that they have absolutely no idea what the implications of doing such a thing are. They just don't have a way to know what the implications of doing the thing are. An interesting idea that I've thought about before is that when they have a venue for voting, you could provide materials where basically like each party gets to make their case and then say the things they don't like about the other party's position. And I think that you would find that people would be more successful to the degree that they are not full of vitriol. Like if people said this other party's position is bad, don't vote for their thing because this is this awful thing it does. I think you would find that if they are literally right there, and people are talking face to face, people generally won't respond as well to people that are being really outrageous and angry and hateful. They will generally respond to more reasoned points. You can give a less biased perspective, even if you have a stake in the discussion. And I think being forced to listen to both parties is not a bad starting point. But again, a lot of these issues it's just not great. I mean, I like the idea of you going to the polls, looking at the ballot, deciding that you don't know. You're not really supposed to vote. You go in because you want to see if you have like a real stake in the discussion. And you probably don't vote. Maybe you do. And maybe if you have time, you listen to the point more. At the polling place, you learn more about the subject, something like that, you know. But I think you can see the reason I'm talking about this is not because it's realistic, but because you can see how kind of reasonable that hopefully sounds, and yet how that is not going to happen and is nothing like our current polling structure, right? We're asking people to vote for things when it's too much to ask that they even have it explained what the thing they're voting for is. You see what I'm trying to say? That is just not acceptable in my mind. That's not getting everyone's perspective. That's rounding everyone's perspective to the ones that are useful to the people that are setting the goalposts. That is not really related. I think that a key topic in discussions of modern democracy is that it sounds bad to not immediately take everybody's vote, but we already aren't taking everybody's vote, just not in a way that feels as direct as some people literally don't vote. Like that seems bad, but actually what we're doing is already worse. And so I personally think it's innocent until proven guilty to some extent. Society doesn't work this way. People aren't going to make an experiment just because of that logic, but I think that makes sense to do. Yeah. I think it, some kind of, you could even imagine something like voting points where you get to go to every ballot, but you don't have like countable votes for every single issue. And you choose which of those ballots you feel your vote actually means something to spend your democracy points or whatever on the issues that you actually care about what you're voting for in. Now, I started this first part of the discussion with this idea that because we kind of can't see what's going on when people vote nowadays, we can't see the issues and we don't see the positives as clearly. It makes democracy seem less appealing, but there's a bigger reason, which is that we see on the internet people sharing their opinion in the most negative and consequence-free way. Only the loudest, shittiest people sharing the loudest, shittiest opinions loudly to each other. That's like the opposite of the democracy you might have seen earlier in human history, where you would see rather the opposite of that. I don't think that either is a particularly significant percentage of people's opinion, but democracy certainly looks worse if you look at it that way, right? It feels like you're letting a bunch of people who hate other people and just want to spite them take their vote. But as I've been talking about this, it's probably worth noting that maybe way more people than I think don't vote already. Like go to the polls, but don't fill anything out because they don't feel qualified to vote. I bet you that that doesn't happen, but I don't know that it doesn't. It's worth saying that any issue about democracy may be a little less extreme than we think it is. I just think it's pretty easy to see how people get kind of tricked into thinking that they're supporting their interests, but they're not. That doesn't sound very hard to do to me as a layperson, and certainly presidents in the past that we could name, much stupider than I, have easily manipulated an entire country of people into voting for them. So it's not that, if that guy can do it, it's not that hard, folks. It doesn't actually benefit basically anyone to vote for previous presidents we've had, and yet they did, right? My uncle voted for Donald Trump. I'm not particularly avoiding saying this person's name. It's just not bad to dissuade people from thinking about this waste of human space. My uncle voted for Donald Trump and was able to come to realize that they messed up. Like, they voted for things they thought were what they wanted, but they were not what they wanted. I kind of wish that he changed his mind, because it's like sort of a hate crime to vote for this person, in my opinion. If you have people, women, for example, in your life, just any women, I personally think it's pretty disrespectful to vote for someone who doesn't care about the lives of half of the population. Like, that's just an example. But it's interesting to see how things have been so bad with that particular example that some people have actually realized their mistake, even though the entire society around them is structured so they won't, basically. I think that's interesting, but it goes to show just how extreme things need to be for people to be able to see the full extent of the decision they've made. It's not their fault. Like, I don't see what they could have done to understand the full context of the situation. Now, this particular example, could they maybe have investigated a little bit more? Yeah, I guess. But there's this thing I remember seeing that was like, John and Sally like disagreed about who they voted on, but are still friends because they're adults, and or whatever. And then there's a version of it that people kind of corrected or edited. I think it's correcting it, in the context of the Trump election, where Sally says, like, Sally learns that John never respected Sally. It's not that they like can agree to disagree. Like, it turns out that John really never cared about Sally's point of view, but it just wasn't clear until they had a thing to vote about it. You know what I mean? Personally, this is a place where I'm a little conflicted, and I might have to leave it for another time. I think it's good for people to find out that they're not good friends, basically. I don't think that's bad. I don't believe in keeping the peace about these things. I think if there's going to be a problem between people, relationships, friendships, I want to dig for it, dig around in there and try to get at it. It's possible that doing so will make a relationship or a friendship fail where it would have succeeded if you'd gone slower. But I think it usually doesn't turn out that way. I think usually there is an underlying problem that will be a problem for both people, and it's basically just delayed. I think it's better for people to just be upfront from the start, and it will very quickly filter through the people you actually want to spend time with. I know that people mostly won't do that just from me saying it. But I actually think that's a complicated psychological question. Like, what is the greater good in situations where it seems like there's something to uncover that would be a sticking point, but what do you do? Like, do you dig in for it? It's not always so obvious, right? And I think that's a little outside the scope of this parlay. The reason I bring it up here is simply that you can see how people understanding their position more may cause disagreements that wouldn't have been there before. I think that people like having a civil disagreement is in some ways kind of bad. Like, a lot of these issues, there may be a right answer. I don't think it's always good to go into these discussions thinking there are going to be multiple valid perspectives that we're going to need to be ready to respect. In this video, the example they brought up was people who don't believe in trans rights. You know what I mean? I don't think that it's good to enter a conversation with someone who thinks that with the perspective that there are multiple valid positions on this issue. Like, there aren't. You do need to respect people's human rights. Like, there are not multiple valid positions for that particular issue. At least not that version of that issue. There might somehow be if you change the stakes, but you need to respect people's sovereignty with their body. That I thought that was a good example. There are issues where the idea that we're going to hear the other side, like there isn't always just magically another side to every single issue. This is where we need to talk a little bit about something very unpleasant that is often referred to as tribalism, human tribalism. The idea that people will tend to group around smaller numbers of worse opinions because they feel like they're on a side or a team. I think a similar phenomenon occurs when you ask people to have a constructed opinion that they can defend and debate with you on the spot, when they don't have an opinion they can defend and discuss with you on the spot. You're basically asking them to overcommit to a poorly thought through perspective that will affect other people. In my notes for this parlay, which I haven't needed it as much as I thought, that I have a lot to say about this topic already, I wrote the idea that if you were to ask for the opinion of someone who isn't ready to give the opinion, it might actually be worse for them that they say their opinion. They will make a bad version of their opinion and then overcommit to it to not seem like they're, too quickly changing their mind or not in a strong enough position. Now that's pretty immature, but like I've hardly ever met anyone who doesn't do that. So I think it's pedantic to say, oh, people just need to learn to not do that. Like you'll hardly ever meet people who don't do that. It takes intense experience to not overcommit to a view that if you want to have fun with this, you can see I don't pretend to be perfect at this subject. I've tried really hard, but it's hard. It's harder than I would think it would be. I will often accidentally try to claim a fact about a thing because I've been conditioned by the stupid way that the internet works about gaming usually to want to claim authority about a subject. And I generally catch myself pretty quick or say, oh, I don't know. I don't really know for sure, but this is what I would imagine, and this is my reasoning. But I will often lead with something much less well thought out, much less good, much more authoritative for no particular reason, and then catch myself. I'm only at the level of, I basically still do it, but I just correct myself really fast. I'm not happy or comfortable sharing that, but I think it's an important detail to, my embarrassment is an important part of this conversation. It's hard to do that. I would be impressed to meet many people who don't, quickly over defend an underdeveloped position because they're asked for one. You can see how the thing I do for work is like the boss mode of this subject. In Parley and streams, I'm essentially just given completely random, moderately involved, sometimes fairly serious questions on the spot and asked to have a balanced perspective about them. And the reason I do this for a living is partly because I wanted to use things like Parley to make myself stop behaving that way, because you cannot have good discussion with people unless you can stop doing that. But it is virtually impossible to stop doing that. I will claim some minor authority. From the perspective of a professional at trying to not do this, it is very difficult not to do. Anyway, I don't think that it's fair to say that people will say like, go educate yourself or, go learn more about this subject. People can't just do that. Where do people have all the time to do that thing? People who say that are upper middle class folks that have the free time, the expendable resources to do that. And that's good that they have those things, but it isn't a solution to say, go learn in depth about this subject that doesn't immediately have anything to do with you. Yet, we live in a society where if they don't do that, they get to have some authority about that subject, even though they themselves would probably admit, under the right circumstances, they really don't know anything about it or have any stake in it. They nevertheless do get to decide something that affects other people, and there isn't really a way they can get out of that situation. You know what I mean? If they don't vote, then our society will gaslight them for not participating in democracy. Now, I think it's good to vote for things. It's good to go. But again, not necessarily to just assert your opinion if you truly have no stake. I think for things like the presidential election, it's a little difficult to think that you have no stake. So I'm not trying to tell people not to vote for that. And really my shtick is, as I said, I want people to go, but just not necessarily literally always vote. That is what I do. I go and nearly always end up voting for things like the presidential election, but I don't always for smaller issues. And I think that makes sense. I just try to do it if I think I'm actually pushing it toward something that's better for other people. And if I think about it with the time that I have, and I can't think of a way that it's like good, not hurting people, to vote for a thing, then I don't, because I don't think that makes things better. There is something to be said about overcompensating for ignorance that maybe we'll get to at the end. I'll write a note. I didn't think of that before this. Anyway, I think that that's the end of my point for this first bit of topic, and you can see how it transitions into the quote from the second part about the sort of two opposing things in democracy. You have to respect the voice of your fellow person and everyone gets a say, but you have to use your voice to make justice happen. That's in conflict. Excuse me. And the bit about democracy being like a skill, I don't think we'll need further discussion in this parlay. We're well and truly covering that. That is my thesis, mostly. You being qualified for the democracy isn't something that I would point out individual people and say you can and you can't. And I think it's worth being suspicious if people do that. But at the same time, it does require some resources to be informed about a subject that you can't just have. You can't just choose to be informed about a subject. You can try, if you might be able to, if you have the time, you can try, but it's not really possible for a lot of people to just have a good perspective about these things. For most people, fact aside, the whole thing I was making about, well, can you learn a balanced perspective on this subject? What the bill is really saying? We're voting between this and this, but what are the parties really trying to get people to do? Knowing the political machinations thing is one thing, but there's also the issue of being able to feel like you can vote for it when the social pressure in a lot of people's communities is you will be socially assassinated if you don't vote for the thing that everybody else voted for. Therefore, you just are going to vote. Most people just are going to vote for the thing that the people around them are. And that doesn't, in an interesting twist, it doesn't maybe make much difference if some of those people don't, because only that logic will only make people on both sides who are socially influenced to make a decision just because other people are to not vote, which won't that even out? But then you would think that would relatively bias the better opinion. If an equal number of people on both sides of a two-sided issue that's being voted on as a two-sided issue, it's probably not, but it's being voted on that way. If an equal number of people on both sides, an equal number of individuals, not an equal percent on both sides, don't vote for something because they decide that doing it because of peer pressure is bad, I would predict that that will make the lead gained by the better perspective on the issue larger. You see what I mean? By percentage, more of the people voting on the issue will have been voting on it because they think it's a good idea, rather than because they were pressured to. If somehow only people who were being pressured to didn't vote on it in equal numbers, which I don't know why that would happen. I'm just saying, in theory, not doing that is good, I guess, but in practice, I don't see why that would happen consistently. Or another way I talk about this a lot is the idea that if you wouldn't vote, I think it's worth thinking about whether the reason you're not voting is a thing that represents more than just your vote. When people in it was the election with Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, that situation, there was this thing in America where a lot of super liberal, and there's a type that I won't ridicule too heavily, even though I want to, for this subject. And I was living in Vermont, so just to give you an idea, a lot of very high, disillusioned liberal people, self-identified as all those things, it's not my words, who said, I'm not going to vote because my vote doesn't count, or I don't like any of the candidates, so I'm not going to vote. And obviously this is stupid because not doing that might feel self-satisfying, but you are voting for the candidate that you don't want because the other candidate doesn't have a huge number of, oh, so enlightened stoner dudes who won't vote for them. Everyone is just going to vote for them because of peer pressure, which sounds like a stupid reason to vote. But ironically, not voting for that reason was kind of even worse in this case. And you could see by the numbers that probably if that bloc had voted, then the non-monstrous president, less bad president, let's not say non-monstrous, would have won the election, which you can decide if that's good or not, but it would have had an influence. And the reason is because their logic that their individual vote didn't count was not wrong in and of itself, but was just misworded. They're not choosing their own vote. That's not really how voting works. You choose a motivation to vote, and then that becomes a block of voters. And I think that those people were maybe just too self-centered to realize that they were not the only person thinking that thing. Ironic, because they would often congregate in groups and talk about how they were, and it's like, oh, everybody else is just voting. Like, no, there's actually tons of people just like you, right in front of you, no less, that are all thinking like, well, I also shouldn't vote, you know? And because that was the case, it ought to have been fairly obvious that that's why you do need to vote, because that means it actually is a lot of votes. If the logic compelling you not to vote compels lots of other people, then it's not just you not voting, that's a whole bunch of other people not voting. There's a weird sort of Schrodinger's democracy thing happening here, where if the thing that motivates you to vote or not, you know, goes one way or the other. If you're thinking about voting and there's something motivating you one way or the other, and you decide one way or the other, it's almost like you just voted a lot of times instead of only a few times, because that logic train of thought that you just went through is going to have compelled many, many other people you just won't see. And again, this goes all the way back to the idea that we're not in a little town square voting together, where you could see the logic motivating other people, and you would know that you needed to participate. Because well, that's why I'm so frustrated by these people, because they could see other people doing that, but they probably felt like there's this whole city around me full of people, and literally just me and my two stoner friends. I'm really going hard on this. You can consume cannabis if you want, by the way. I'm just making fun of this trope. I'm sorry, not sorry. You're allowed to consume cannabis if you want. This is not everybody who, I don't know, like uses drugs. I'm just trying to say this was a whole group of people that I spent a lot of time walking past in Vermont at the time. And it was painful to see how they were looking right in front of them at the evidence that they needed to vote, but then didn't because of that same reasoning. I don't know. That's sort of wild. It was kind of maddening to me. Full disclosure, I actually was a person who, I think the very first time I legally could vote, I just barely didn't. Like, I was busy or something, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I didn't take it as seriously as I could have, and that incident was what made me take it seriously. I, a person who always hates all of the presidential candidates, went out to vote because I realized that obviously that way of thinking was leading me to an outcome I wanted less. You can still choose the lesser of two evils. Politicians aren't your friends. What do you mean you like one of the candidates? Get out of here. Like, splash some water on your face. Like, none of them are good. We're just, the exercise isn't about voting for the one you like. That's just so weird to me. Or people will say, like, I really like, you know, this candidate this year. Like, why do you like politicians? Like, you don't. I promise you don't. That's wild to me. But anyway, for me, that incident was actually why I started voting. I mean, I only didn't one time, and I had no real intention of doing so. I think that because I explained that thing about being motivated by certain logic to vote or not, it's worth responsibly pointing out that you may make an excuse for yourself. You know, if your excuse is, well, it doesn't have anything to do with my opinion on the subject. I'm just busy. You know, I'm like, I have work or something. They'll probably let you go vote, you know, for one thing. I know most people know that. But I think something people often miss is that the motivation needn't be something that's a personal decision. This might be obvious to some of you, but humor me for everyone else. You know, the way it goes is that you say, oh, I have, you know, a doctor's appointment to get to or something. Let me ask you, what kind of people do you think don't go, you know, vote or whatever? They don't have to do it because they have a good healthcare provider service they need to attend. Relatively better off people, right? And what kind of people would be in a social environment where even if they did have such a thing, it might not be as great of a service they're receiving. Even if they did have such an appointment, they would be pressured to go vote. Well, maybe people who are following the crowd and voting for a candidate that is being propelled by a mob. Likely not the same person you want to vote for. So if you're motivated by voting for someone who you're not going to vote for because you're busy, in a way that people who would vote for their opponent are not busy, you probably ought to go vote, because that's going to happen to a lot of other people in the same block of voters. You can see this in a nice way in the United States, where I don't think that this makes democracy better than Democrats better than Republicans. That's a pretty common Democratic argument. That's a pretty common liberal sentiment in the United States. I don't buy into that. But it is true that oftentimes you can see pretty clearly how a lot less people in more educated segments of the population don't vote as much, because maybe they feel like they have stuff to do, or they think their vote doesn't count as much. Whereas other people probably also don't think their specific opinion matters that much, but they're more influenced by the social environment right around them and are basically just kind of forced to vote for some other candidate. And you often see the Democratic candidate getting less votes than maybe you would expect statistically, because people just don't vote for reasons that don't necessarily apply to the other side of the equation, which is an artifact of heavy income inequality. But I think it's good to think about that. Like, why are people behaving this way? Does that affect other people? If you want your candidate you think would make the world a better place to win, it's worth thinking about that. I don't really care about such things. I'll be honest. I don't care that much. I don't think it's going to make the world that much of a better place. I still do it because I think that engaging with the subject is helpful. I think that thinking about practicing the skill of democracy is more valuable than, like me, I probably am a relative outlier. I have a truly exceptional amount of time to think about these things. So I don't know, to some extent you could say it is just my one vote, but I also just made this video for a whole bunch of people. I don't know, like that affects people. So I feel like it's only responsible, if I'm going to speak to an audience for any reason, to at least think about this subject, which is why I have, even though I personally don't have much of a stake. That is where that motivation is coming from. To me, that is the using your voice to make justice happen, not actually actively voting all the time just for the sake of voting, but engaging with the fact that you are being affected by these systems and potentially participating in affecting other people. Not so much the idea that people tend to say it's your civic duty to go vote. My rewording, as I've said earlier in the parlay, is I think it's your duty to show up. Like, if you really don't think that you have any relevant thing to say, yeah, I think it's good in that case, only in that case, to not vote, sure. But that is not the decision almost anyone is making, as far as I can tell. I would unhesitatingly say you just need to go vote. Like, if that's the simplification that gets people to do the thing I want, fine. But if we could get everyone to go do that, I would then want a lot of people to maybe consider not voting. That probably wouldn't work, but that would be my 2 cents. Yeah, there's a metagaming vote thing that I brought up before, overcompensating for ignorance. This is this idea that maybe I'll vote for something that if I'm not sure, but I have a feeling like there's a lot of lobbying, or I've heard a lot of people who I know they haven't spent the time to think about it. I tend to be influenced to vote for the other thing, which tends to make me think I probably ought not to. That seems like a pretty blind. I feel pretty manipulated. I am closing my eyes and filling one in. That is not probably good. I don't know, but I will admit that is something that I think about a lot, and something I learned about myself from going to show up and not necessarily voting. That I'm the kind of person to want to game the system a little bit, to even it out a little. In my mind, it's like, well, if I know nothing about this, but I know that this perspective influences a lot of people who haven't thought about it. I don't know they haven't thought about it, but who haven't thought about it, whatever that seems like to me. Maybe I'll vote against it, not particularly to encourage that other side to win, but just to try to slightly eliminate the over bias toward like people voting for something they don't really understand. I don't think that's a good idea, but that is something I think about a lot. And I bet some of you do too. I'm not sure. It would be interesting to unpack, and I haven't, which is why I won't do it yet. The implications of doing that. Like, what if you model voting and some actors behave that way? How does that play out? So, Yeah, that I don't know, that's a thing, but I mostly wanted to highlight it because I think it's a place to be cautious, and I think you're all thoughtful people who are maybe prone to the tomfoolery that I experienced. I'm not sure that's good. There's some perils to thinking through a thing. There's a topic that I didn't really get to in the parlay yet that I do have a few things to say about, so I'll close on them as food for thought, which is the idea of worshiping the concept of discussion. I don't know if that's a direct quote from what I listened to or not, but the idea that people, of course it's true that people have a tendency to feel good about discussing a thing even if they didn't accomplish much. Something that I try to set as a goal in my parlay is to make some kind of claim, even if thoroughly qualified as something I don't know. This is just my 2 cents at the moment. I like to say something rather than just speculating about what I could think. I like to take a chance, think a few things. You'll develop your opinion that way, just only after thoroughly establishing that I really don't care much about this opinion I've currently come to hold. Because again, this is something you'll find people will really die on the hill of that thing that they've attached to. Or they think, can I really be a person who doesn't pull the lever in the trolley problem and lets someone get killed? Like, you really can, like that. Who doesn't pull the lever and gets 3 people get killed? Can I really be a person who, like, pulls the lever and kills a man? If it saves more people, then I don't understand why you're so insistent on, like, you technically didn't touch the lever. If we're all watching, you're clearly guilty as far as I'm concerned. I hate the trolley problem so much. It's astonishing how long it will take people to agree that the lesser of 2 evils is for less people to die, instead of the lesser of 2 evils being them being blamed because they touched a lever. Like, I don't care if you touched the lever. Like, you were the active agent. If you don't touch the lever, it might as well be that the lever was gonna go this way and you pulled it to make it go the other way. It's irrelevant whether you actually touched the lever, to me anyway. In a court of law, I'm not qualified to say. But my point is that I think you'll find that when people discuss such things, it often kind of goes nowhere or sort of means nothing. You know what I mean? You often hear this trope where, like, a couple or very close friends will say, we disagree on this, like, political issue, but we're, like, still cool with it or whatever. And I always think to myself, just how often do you actually discuss that subject, though? You know what I mean? If you bring up politics, say nothing of consequence, but then just include the word of your party politically, and those words are different, you might be fooled into thinking that you both respect each other's perspective without looking closely and noticing you didn't actually go into detail about what you actually think on these 2 sides. I think people also have a tendency to use the terms for their political parties, like in America, it would be Democratic and Republican. They have a tendency to use those terms for what they academically mean rather than what they socially mean, which seems very pedantic to me. It feels like I'm not here to say what the term implies, but I think it's worth keeping in mind just how few people really are thinking of the definition you have in mind when you say the academic definition. I'm not here to tell you it's wrong, but other people don't know it. And so if you do mean that way, other people don't know what you're trying to say. Like, that is, and I think there is a self-satisfaction in there. I'm guilty of this in other places in my life where I kind of want to discuss to sort of assuage the fear of not having discussed, but I maybe make it worse. This will be like with trust with people. I'll say, I'm gonna, with this is a mundane example because I'm sick of all these serious political examples. With my folks, for example, my parents are quite cautious, very protective. They're just trying to keep me safe, but they can go a bit far. I had the conversation with my mom that will always stick in my memory where I said, I'm going to go for a walk. And she said, it looks like there's going to be a thunderstorm. And I said, I'm walking like around in a forest and there's light rain. The odds of there even being a thunderstorm, let alone me getting hit by lightning in the like 10 minutes I'm going on a walk, are so low. These are the odds and this is how lightning comes down. And my mom said, but the chance is above 0 that you'll get hit by lightning. Therefore, it's automatically a bad idea. And I thought, Like, think about if you took that perspective to the extreme. Like, if you really engaged with the idea that if the chance of danger is above 0, you won't do it, you would, of course, never do anything. And my mom isn't being disingenuous. She's saying that to her, as a parent who's worried about their child, the danger is high enough that it feels uncomfortable. And I'm saying, but this is what the chance is of being in danger, so I'm going to take the risk, which kind of seems worse to some people. But I personally think that being aware of that is better. You might make people feel better temporarily if you say, hey, I'm going to go play roulette, and there's like a 1 in 100 chance that this seedy casino steals my credit card information, but like it'll probably be fine, you know? That's like sort of true when you go to a lot of institutions. You know, there's like a 1 in 10,000 chance that someone will steal your identity if you type stuff into the internet. I don't know. I'm just making things up, but you get what I'm trying to say. Like, there's some risk. And people have a bias where they view it as more risky if you say what the amount of risk is. But that's less risky because you know what the risk you're taking is. And I think it's very much the same thing. Like, discussing these things in a way that isn't direct can be bad, I think. It tends to make it seem safer when it actually isn't, whereas discussing the details makes it feel less good, but that's actually better. You know, if you discuss how likely you are to come out even when you gamble over and over again, rather than discussing how likely you are to lose money once, it feels way less good to discuss the bad odds, but that's obviously way better, like, for you, you know? And I think this is the case too. I think this is a good parlay to the extent that there are not a lot of parlay about this subject, because being overwhelmed by this can quickly turn it into mush. I worried that this was already too long, and I ought to have cut myself off halfway through with only one of the 2 points. But I thought vampbug would like it more if I used both of their previous usernames, handles instead. If I went on at some length. And I had plenty of things to say. I could easily talk about this for longer. They got on a fairly large, truly unrelated tangent in the video clip that you sent me for a few minutes. They talked about fasting / self-harm. And I think that that's oddly useful as a perspective point for the discussion they were having. Some people are going to do the thing where they say, you're a person who thinks that you can only be mentally healthy by not eating for 9 days. That is not a healthy thing to do regularly without if you are saying it as if it is a mental health, health issue. I don't know. If you're doing it because you say you need it for your mental health, it is not healthy to not eat for 9 days. I think that's not a controversial statement. And so some people will go, well, the things that they said are coming from a place where they would say something like that. I don't know. I think that this is actually a great case study for a totally different parlay we didn't do about how you might interpret people's opinions differently because of what surrounds them. And I think I am helped at not doing that by being asked to talk about it in an intellectual way for 45 minutes. That was useful. I wasn't going to say that. I try very hard not to bias that way. Your argument is your argument. It's not worse because you are saying something unrelated that is not good. But at the same time, when people don't have enough time to break something down, they tend to do that. They tend to take that shortcut. And I will admit that while I wasn't going to mention that at all, I think it even less than I did at the start of the parlay now, right? The points are worth discussing to some extent, I think. And that knowledge makes me even less likely to say, well, but are you really in a state to be deciding how democracy works? I mean, they're not. They're just discussing it. It's fine. I just thought that was worth noting. If you do look at the video, that might be something that catches your attention. And I think it is, a red herring as much as it ever is to, like, the people are irrelevant, only the ideas matter. But at the same time, should you take a passing glance because you're interested in getting the context for the parlay? I could imagine you getting embroiled in that and throwing this entire conversation out because you think, oh, Zandy, you don't have to take their opinion seriously because they're saying stuff like that. Like, nah, that's irrelevant. I think. I hope this was fun. I had a good time. I had lots of stuff to talk about. I hope it was useful. It was fairly long, so I hope I got through a lot of stuff. I feel like I did, but that it was easy to pair apart.